A night of violence in Jerusalem. Police used water cannons and stun grenades to force back a group of far-right Jewish extremists. The group had led hundreds of protesters, shouting anti-Arab slogans to the gates of the old city, before they were blocked by officers. Barely a few hundred meters away, Palestinians were also facing off against police. Hundreds of riot officers intervened to stop the two groups from meeting, creating a virtual no-man's land between them. Palestinians have been clashing with police on a nightly basis since Ramadan began 10 days ago. They accuse the authorities of stopping them from holding their evening gatherings outside the Damascus Gate. It lies next to one of Islam's holiest sites, the Noble Sanctuary, which is itself located next to the holiest site in Judaism. Security forces say the measures are necessary to prevent outbreaks of violence. East Jerusalem has long been a flashpoint between Israel and the Palestinians. It has been occupied by Israel since the 1967 Middle East War. Palestinians want it to be the capital of a future state, whereas Israel claims the entire city as its own capital.
They are carefully designed to keep out the rising sea. More than 70,000 concrete blocks will strengthen the Afsluitdijk and protect the Netherlands against storms and high waves. Made with recycled material from the old dike, every single one of the 6,500 kilogram blocks contains an electronic chip.
You know, when you have a super storm and there is somewhere some issue with one of these blocks or so, it's a little bit gone down or cracked or something, then we can trace it and find out which block it is, take it out.
When construction began in the 1920s, many did not believe the Dutch could close off an entire sea and build a 32-kilometer-long dike. Thousands of people worked on the project one stone at a time.
It was a gigantic project nearly a century ago, and it's a mega project once again. It will take 7 years before the Afsluitdijk will be strong enough again. But it is predicted that it will only protect the Dutch heartland against the sea until 2050. After that, more reinforcements are likely needed. People who were protesting against the construction of the dike in the early 1900s could not have guessed how crucial it would be in the future.
Fishing communities surrounding the southern sea lost their source of income when it turned into a sweetwater lake. Behind the dike, parts of the sea bottom were reclaimed and islands disappeared. Yuri van den Berg's grandfather was among those protesting against the project.
If all these people back then could have looked into the future and would see how much welfare it has brought and how it has taken our country forward, they would not have protested. Reclaiming land has been a huge victory for the Netherlands.
From a country importing food, the Netherlands turned into an exporter.
Well, we are now at the bottom of the Zuiderzee. So they made a huge polder at the Zuiderzee, and it is the biggest polder of the world.
Historians say countries adapting to a changing climate can learn important lessons from the Dutch experience after building the Afsluitdijk.
So these fishery communities had a very strong sense of community, and that made them very resilient before this big change. So if you have a community that has a very strong sense of togetherness, they are more resilient.
And resilience will be needed because in 30 years this barrier might not be high enough once again.
What can you do if you need a stronger dike, a higher dike?
You call us again and we make it higher.
When the Dutch built the dike, they wanted to prove that in order to obtain land you don't need to go to war, not realizing that a different battle against rising sea levels was just around the corner.
Hundreds of tropical islands surrounded by turquoise waters, a true paradise, but the Sunblast archipelago could well disappear within a few decades as water levels keep on rising.
See, the water reaches these rocks now. They used to be out of reach. We keep on strengthening the dikes, but the waves just tear them away.
Jaime was born here on the island of Cartimulatub. Like all Gunas, he makes a living out of fishing, small-scale farming and a little tourism. Like many young people, he is getting ready to leave the island, but not out of will.
Our elders have lived here for so long. They don't want to move to the mainland. We, the youth, some of us have some land over there in the mountains. But we're going to lose our Guna traditions.
The San Blas Islands are now overcrowded. Janet, who lives in Kartitupile, is the daughter of the island's tribe leader. She knows that the Guna houses cannot resist climate disruption.
Here we are at sea, in the middle of nowhere. If there was a hurricane, we would lose everything. I think I'm going to move to the city.
Her father, however, doesn't believe in climate change. He tries to convince the youngest to stay on the archipelago, where the tribe has been preserving its autonomy for centuries.
When I was a kid, one day the water suddenly rose. Everything was flooded. I could literally swim here in my backyard. Back then, no one was pretending that the island was about to disappear.
The locals build dikes with whatever they can find. As rocks are scarce on the islands, they use corals that they remove from the surrounding reefs. Little by little, this ends up weakening these true natural defenses.
Plumes of toxic smoke leaking from power plants and factories is a common sight in Shanxi. The northwestern province has for decades powered China's economic growth, primarily by burning coal. It's contributed to the nation becoming the world's top polluter, responsible for roughly 1/3 of global carbon emissions. The coal industry employs most of the people who live here.
Pollution? It's been polluting for decades. If they shut down all the factories, what are we going to do? Everyone works for the factories.
Last year, this region produced about 1.1 billion tons of coal.
China's reliance on burning coal as its main source of energy is its biggest obstacle to lowering carbon emissions. The government is struggling to find ways to curb its use of coal without affecting jobs or harming economic growth.
Pollution caused by burning fossil fuels regularly shrouds the capital in heavy smog. Beijing has pledged to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and eliminate them altogether by 2060, but it's yet to detail how exactly it plans to achieve this.
It's not only about commitment, it's all about what we actually do, right? In the next 5 years, we expect China can implement more concrete policies and to give us a more clear roadmap how they're going to achieve these two carbon targets.
Increasing the use of renewable energy sources is crucial. China is already the world's largest producer of wind and solar power. It's also the biggest market for electric vehicles. The government has tightened regulations to pressure car makers into transitioning away from gas. But many say that's not enough. US climate envoy John Kerry was in Shanghai last week, trying to convince authorities to do more.
For a big country with 1.4 billion people, these goals are not easily delivered. Some countries are asking China to do more on climate change. I'm afraid this is not very realistic.
Researchers say China must close down more than 500 coal-fired power plants in the next decade to meet its climate pledges. But it continues to approve new ones at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world. The Shanxi government is planning to close down some older factories here and build what it says are greener, more efficient coal facilities. For some parts of China at least, it seems the road to clean energy will be long and slow.
Farmers in the village of Kalayaji can do nothing as water levels drop. The canals connected to wells through which they were irrigating their fields have run dry. The wheat is growing at a slow pace. And as water has become even more scarce, farmers worry there may be no harvest season this year.
We worry a lot. We worry if this water gets scarcer, where will we go? We're very concerned about where we should go. But let's see what God will decide for us.
Half of Afghanistan's provinces have been gripped by a drought crisis, and climate change is being blamed. There's been limited snowfall and rain, both vital during the spring and summer farming seasons.
Humanitarian organizations are warning that people in many parts of Afghanistan face severe water shortages, including drinking water. It's also likely to create shortages of food, as there's not enough to properly irrigate crops.
2020 was the year that for many normality stopped. The COVID-19 pandemic meant many factories and offices across the world closed, commuters stayed at home, and airports were largely empty as the global air networks were reduced to skeleton schedules. You might think the resulting drop in carbon emissions had a discernible effect on the environment. It didn't. The year, which saw the largest ever wildfires in California and Colorado and global sea levels rising, was still one of the warmest 3 years on record.
The data in this report should alarm us all. 2020 was 1.2 degrees Celsius hotter than pre-industrial times. We are getting dangerously close to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was set by the scientific community. We are on the verge of the abyss.
So why did the slowdown caused by the pandemic not have a more positive effect on the environment? According to the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, because the effects were temporary. Carbon dioxide levels have been building up over many decades.
Last year we had about 7% drop in the emissions because of less traffic and less industrial activities and less consumption of energy. But since this gas has this cumulative nature, we haven't seen impact in the real atmosphere.
This grim report, the UN says, is something every world leader should read. Many prime ministers and presidents will be attending a virtual summit organised by President Biden on Earth Day this Thursday. The UN Secretary General says he wants to hear promises of action from countries rather than just more words. James Bayes, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.
Back at the forefront of the global fight against climate change, the United States set itself an aggressive new goal: halve US carbon emissions below 2005 levels by the end of the decade.
These steps will set America on a path of net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. But the truth is, America represents less than 15% of the world's emissions. No nation can solve this crisis on our own, as I know you all fully understand.
Setting aside its tensions with the US, China, the world's largest carbon emitter, vowed to reduce its heavy reliance on coal.
We will strictly control coal-fired power generation projects. China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060.
EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen announced the ambitious expansion of the bloc's carbon emissions trading system. Its CO2 permits, which effectively put a price on pollution, will apply to buildings and transport. Emerging economies, the nations most vulnerable to climate disasters, said they were willing to cut emissions, but needed more international funds to do so. At a different virtual Earth Day meeting, organised by US lawmakers, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg said world leaders had failed to grasp the scale of the climate crisis.
If you compare the current so-called climate policies to the overall current best available science, you clearly see that there's a huge gap. How long do you honestly believe that people in power like you will get away with it?
The signatories of the Paris Accord will meet again in November at the COP26 in Scotland and announce updated emissions targets. The 2015 agreement aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century.
With India's health service buckling under a dramatic surge in COVID-19 cases, many patients are being turned away as hospital beds fill up and oxygen supplies run low.
मेरा लड़का है अंकित, जिसकी उम्र 32 साल है, वो उसका लेबर कम हो जा रहा है, ऑक्सीजन, और ये कह रहे ऑक्सीजन नहीं है, ना बेड है.
The surge in cases is being linked to the spread of new, more infectious variants of the virus, including one that originated in India, but many also blame authorities. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has been wary of the economic impact of strict lockdown measures and in recent weeks has been criticised for holding packed political rallies for local elections and allowing a Hindu festival that was attended by millions. This week, Modi urged state governments to use lockdowns as a last resort, but asked people to stay indoors.
लोगों में काफी भय है और दहशत है और लोगों ने खुद अपने आप को लॉकडाउन कर लिया है.
Health experts say India let its guard down during the winter when cases were at a low.
We were lulled into a sense of complacency. People wanted to get out of a year-long restriction. People wanted to get back to work.
Only a tiny fraction of the Indian population has received a vaccination, and while authorities have announced vaccines will be available to anyone over 18 from May the 1st, experts say there will not be enough for the some 600 million people who will become eligible.
Geoffrey Maloke's wife, Pauline, died from COVID-19 complications in March. A government isolation facility in Kitui in eastern Kenya, where they live, did not have enough oxygen.
My wife was suffering, so we decided to move her to Nairobi. We called so many hospitals, but they were full. When we finally got one, we had to quickly pay a down payment because 6 other people were on the queue.
In neighboring Machakos County, health workers take us to the intensive care unit, or ICU. All 12 beds have been occupied for a while.
When we get patients who also require COVID-19 ICU care, then we talk to the surrounding neighboring counties to see whether they have beds available.
The country's nearly 600 ICU beds fill up first, and demand for oxygen has almost doubled to about 800 tons. Government hospitals don't have enough, and health ministry officials say thousands of cylinders are being hoarded by individuals for private medical or industrial use. But there is some hope. This is the country's largest privately owned steel factory. It has stopped all production, losing about $30,000 a day to provide the oxygen to hospitals for free.
Hundreds of hospitals and health centers get their oxygen from here. About 1,000 cylinders are filled up with the gas every day, full supply. But even that is not nearly enough to meet the demand.
One patient is taking almost 3 cylinders of oxygen every day. And it is impossible for any hospitals to cope up with this demand.
To avert the total collapse of the healthcare system, the government wants to reach herd immunity to the disease through vaccinations as quickly as possible. Nearly 1 million people have so far had their first dose of the UN COVAX-distributed AstraZeneca vaccine. But the supplies are running low, and there's uncertainty about the availability of AstraZeneca for the second jobs. Machakos Hospital has vaccinated about 12,000 people. But authorities are concerned about those falling ill and dying in rural villages.
So what have we done? Now we've required that every person who dies in Machakos has to be tested for COVID. Because people are falling dead, some of them may fall dead at home, especially older people.
Back in Kitui, Maluki tells us he wants the government to provide facilities for patients who cannot afford private hospitals so they don't go through the same trauma his family did. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera.
Overcome with grief and anger, this man and other family members of 14 people killed in a fire at this hospital in Maharashtra state broke down as they confronted staff. The blaze swept through the intensive care unit, or ICU.
Unfortunately, a major fire disaster happened at our hospital at about 3 a.m. There was a sudden spark from the air conditioner, and since there was a lot of oxygen supply in the ICU, it was completely engulfed within 2 minutes.
2 days ago in the same state, a leak in an oxygen tanker killed 24 COVID-19 patients on ventilators after their supply was disrupted. Many Indian states are facing a critical shortage of hospital beds and oxygen supplies. In the capital, New Delhi, distraught family members are struggling to find beds for their loved ones.
I've been running around for a hospital to get my mother admitted since the 21st of April. I've visited all the hospitals in Delhi. They all say the same thing, that beds are not available. Another patient, my son, is at home. Who do I take care of? I'm so stressed.
Reports of people dying because they can't find beds or oxygen are increasing every day. This is one of New Delhi's biggest private hospitals, where the director said 25 people died in one day because of low oxygen supply. The family of a 39-year-old man who passed away says his oxygen was reduced without their knowledge and that his last words were, "Please save me." They also say they counted at least 45 bodies and that a catastrophe is being covered up. The hospital's chairman says they've never had so many deaths in one day, but he denies they were a result of oxygen shortage. New Delhi's leader has pleaded with Prime Minister Narendra Modi to ensure the uninterrupted delivery of oxygen to the capital after reports it was being stopped by bordering states.
We can't leave our people to die. We need people to understand that every life is important to us. I appeal to you on behalf of the people of Delhi, if concrete steps aren't taken, the city will witness a catastrophe.
As staff at crematoriums and burial grounds work day and night, the government has begun using planes and trains to transport the life-saving gas. Elizabeth Puranam, Al Jazeera, New Delhi.
Russian troops have finally started leaving Ukraine's border amid growing fears of another potential major conflict erupting in the region. However, Moscow says it's leaving some heavy weapons behind for more massive military drills later this year. Tensions between the two countries have remained increasingly high after Russia seized Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula in 2014 and continued to support Russian separatists across the region. The U.S. welcomed the move but demanded Moscow follow through with concrete actions.
Well, we have heard Russia's announcement, its announcement that it would begin withdrawing troops from the border of Ukraine. As I said, we've heard words. I think what we'll be looking for is action. The United States will continue to monitor the situation. We'll do that closely, and we'll coordinate closely with Ukrainian officials as well as allies and partners throughout. We have made clear in our engagement with the Russian government that it needs to refrain from escalatory actions and immediately cease all its aggressive activity in and around Ukraine, including its recent military buildup in occupied Crimea and on Ukraine's border, and its intention to block specific vessels in the parts of the Black Sea.
All right, let's dig a little deeper. Let's bring in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini. So, Ruffini, what exactly made Russia announce the troop withdrawal from the region? I was actually surprised when I saw the headline. So explain to our audience why those troops were there in the first place and what was their main purpose?
So both things are a little unclear. The Russians said that, the Russians have occupied this part of Ukraine and they've held it for a while now. And they said they have the right to move their forces in and out of the area that they control, in and out of what they consider their territory as much as they like. They said these were military exercises. They were free to do it as long as they stayed on their side of things, and everybody else could just kind of leave them alone. And then almost as inexplicably, they decided to pull back, and they made this announcement that they're pulling back. But, we've been asking the State Department, did you get notified in advance before they did this? They said they weren't going to discuss that. You have to assume that there are back-channel communications going on, considering all the other heightened tensions going on with Russia, right? The Biden administration put these sweeping sanctions on Russia, including kicking out 10 Russian officials from the U.S. The Russians reciprocated by sanctioning a bunch of American officials, kicking out 10 Americans, and they went further saying that Russian local employees can no longer work at the embassy. As you know, Vlad, around the world, American embassies have diplomats, they have foreign service officers, and then they also hire locally, and that's really important because who knows the country better than people who live there? So they advise, they help do administrative work, and they're a key part of the workforce. Yesterday we asked what the ramifications of that would be. The State Department said it likely would impact their workforce. It would impact personnel, but they haven't received that official notice from the Russians yet when those people have to stop working, if they have to stop working. And what we saw this week as well in Europe, the Czech Republic and Slovakia also expelled Russian diplomats. So there was this diplomatic pressure around the world for Russia to pull back because it was really heightening tensions in a region that's already unstable. But why the Russians actually decide to do that, it's a little unclear.
Supporters of Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan will not be silenced. Known as TLP, they started protesting last year after caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad were republished in France. Then, last week, they protested after the government arrested their leader, cleric Saad Rizvi. He had demanded the French ambassador in Pakistan be expelled and a ban on French products. Those protests resulted in the government outlawing TLP, which led to more protests.
On Sunday, a party spokesman said security forces raided their offices in Lahore. They responded again on the streets. In all, several of their supporters were killed and dozens were injured.
The police straight away started shelling and fired bullets directly at us. Our boys were injured. Some got bullets in the chest. Some got shot in the head.
They fired directly at us and threw acid water. Some men had their chest burned, others their back, face or body.
Hours later, they returned with their original grievance against France.
We told the police we neither have weapons nor are we terrorists, but they started firing on us and used tear gas. Many supporters died, and those who were killed had one slogan: "O Prophet, we are here for you. Expel the French ambassador and cut off relations with France."
Lahore police said Sunday's violence began after a police station was attacked. They accused TLP supporters of taking 6 officers hostage, torturing some. Prime Minister Imran Khan said more than 600 officers were injured in protests last week. There is a media blackout, while social media has been cut in some areas. The TLP's anger towards France reverberates through many Muslim-majority nations. In October, Macron defended the publication of caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad, caricatures that French schoolteacher Samuel Paty had shown in class before he was beheaded. Boycotts and protests were organised in Bangladesh, Somalia, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq and here in Pakistan, championed by the TLP. 6 months later, their party is banned, their leader detained, their supporters killed and wounded, and still they chant on. Charlotte Bellis, Al Jazeera.
Around a quarter of Yemen's 4 million internally displaced people have taken refuge in Marib. A major Houthi offensive there means they're in danger again. They just want the fighting to end.
My husband lost his mind because of the war. He keeps beating the children and cursing us. I have a 13-year-old girl who was abused until she became like her father and now does the same things her father does, all because of this war.
The battle for Marib is the war's deadliest in years, threatening a peace initiative backed by the US and the UN, which calls for a nationwide ceasefire. Fighting has intensified in recent days, and despite heavy losses, the Houthis are pushing on. They've come up with their own proposal with a more gradual ceasefire, the stall in negotiations allowing them more time to secure the region. Yemeni government sources claim the Houthis are sending in waves of young recruits.
The Houthi strategy is to push weak fighters forward, to exhaust the opponent. They send children and fighters with little experience, who we find either dead or we arrest.
So far, Marib's been shielded with airstrikes carried out by the coalition led by Saudi Arabia, which backs the Yemeni government. It would be a major blow to them if they lost the oil-rich region, which is crucial to the country's energy supply. With it, the Houthis, backed by Iran, would control a large proportion of Yemen's resources and population and would have more leverage in future negotiations. The outcome of the battle could complicate US diplomacy in the Middle East. It's ended military support for the Saudi-led coalition, putting pressure on them to end the war, while also attempting to re-engage with Iran.
Lockdowns, curfews, and social distancing. For eating disorder sufferers, coronavirus restrictions can be triggering. Agnes has found herself focusing on food and exercise as a coping strategy.
During the lockdown, I was furloughed from work, so I had stopped doing any activity in the day. Then I started an exercise regime that was, I would say, extreme. I did 2 hours of sport a day. I started to reduce my portion sizes, and when I saw the number on the scales go down, that made me happy. I even started to cut out certain kinds of food.
More than a year into the pandemic, and the toll on mental health is high.
The lockdown, everything together, it started to get very difficult for morale. Everyone has lost the motivation to get up in the morning to do anything. We have the same routine. We aren't able to spend time with our families or socialize.
Many people are cut off from their support networks. Disrupted routines and limits on freedoms have contributed to a surge in eating disorder referrals.